I'm the oldest daughter in a suburban family, the one everyone calls when something needs fixing. My life flipped on a Tuesday night when my parents called, not to check on me, but to say my brother needed money again. They spoke fast, like this was routine, and then the sentence that stopped me cold landed. "You're stronger. You'll figure it out. He can't." In that moment, I saw it clearly. I was never the first choice. I was the backup plan. I told them I wouldn't send money anymore, wouldn't sign anything anymore, and that this decision was final. As soon as I said it, there was a knock at my door, sharp and urgent, as if someone had arrived ahead of the silence that followed the call. If you want to know what happened after that knock, stay with me a little longer. Before everything broke open, I need to take you back to show you how I grew up being the one who was always expected to hold it together. I didn't answer the door right away. I stood there with my phone still warm in my hand, staring at the wall as if it might explain how my life had slid so quietly into that moment. I remember noticing how calm the house felt, how the clock kept ticking like nothing important had happened, and how strange it was that a single sentence could rearrange the way I saw my entire family. Growing up, I was always introduced as the dependable one, the responsible one, the daughter who never caused trouble and never needed much. I wore those labels like they were part of my name, even before I understood what they cost. If any of this sounds familiar to you, stay with me for a bit. Sometimes it helps to hear how someone else carried the same weight without realizing it. When I was a child, my parents liked to tell people how lucky they were to have me. They said I was easy. I slept through the night. I did my homework without reminders. I learned early how to read a room and adjust myself to it, how to sense when silence was safer than questions. No one asked me to do that outright. It was something I picked up by watching how tension moved through our house, how it settled in the corners when my brother struggled, and how quickly it lifted when I stepped in to help. I became good at filling gaps, emotional gaps, practical ones, the spaces where expectations lived but were never spoken aloud. I didn't think of it as sacrifice back then. It felt more like gravity. This is just where things fell. When my parents argued about money, I stopped asking for new shoes. When my brother needed help with school, I stayed up late explaining things I barely understood myself. I learned how to soothe before I learned how to ask. Praise came easily, but it was always tied to what I could handle, not who I was. "You're so mature," they'd say, smiling with relief. "We don't have to worry about you." I absorbed that sentence until it became a quiet rule. Don't need, don't falter, don't add weight. As I grew older, that rule followed me everywhere. In high school, I worked part-time and saved most of what I earned, just in case. In college, I chose a major that felt practical instead of exciting, something that promised stability. I told myself I liked it. I probably did, in a way, but there was always this underlying belief that my life needed to make sense to other people, that it needed to be useful. When my parents called during those years, it was usually to update me on my brother, his changing plans, his setbacks, his potential. They spoke about him with concern and hope tangled together. When they spoke about me, it was with certainty. "She's fine," they'd say, and I was. Until I wasn't, and even then, I didn't know how to say it out loud. I married young, or at least younger than I expected to. My partner saw me as capable too, but in a different way. He noticed when I took on too much. He asked questions I wasn't used to answering. The first time he offered to help me without being asked, I felt oddly exposed, like I'd forgotten a line in a play I'd been performing my whole life. With him, I started to imagine a future that wasn't built entirely around being needed. Still, the old patterns didn't disappear. They just learned how to coexist with my new life. Every family gathering brought them back. The familiar dynamics slid into place as soon as we sat down together. My parents would relax when they saw me, as if my presence itself was proof that things were under control. My brother would drift in and out of conversations, charming and restless, always on the edge of something. If plans fell apart, eyes turned to me. If decisions needed to be made, I was included, not because my opinion mattered most, but because I'd follow through. I told myself this was normal. This is what families do. They rely on each other. I just didn't question why the reliance only seemed to flow in one direction. There were moments when doubt crept in, small and sharp. Like the time my parents forgot to come to a presentation I'd worked months on, then called later to explain they'd been dealing with something urgent involving my brother. Or the holidays, when my gifts were practical and modest, while his were generous and hopeful, as if they were investing in a future that kept slipping away. Each time, I swallowed the disappointment quickly. I didn't want to be unfair. I didn't want to seem ungrateful. Mostly, I didn't want to risk the role that kept everything running smoothly. Motherhood changed the texture of that role in ways I didn't expect. When I held my child for the first time, something inside me shifted, slow and undeniable. I looked at this small person who depended on me completely, and I felt a fierce clarity I'd never known before. I promised myself I would notice her needs. I would listen. I would not confuse love with usefulness. That promise didn't feel like rebellion at the time. It felt like instinct. But it planted a question that wouldn't leave me alone. If I could see so clearly what my child deserved, why had it taken me so long to ask what I deserved? That question hovered in the background of my life, growing louder with each phone call from my parents. The requests became more frequent, though they were rarely framed as such. They were stories, updates, situations that somehow always ended with an unspoken pause, waiting for me to fill it. Sometimes I offered help before they asked, anticipating the need. Other times I waited, testing what would happen if I didn't. The silence felt heavy, uncomfortable. It made me anxious in a way I recognized from childhood, so I stepped in, again and again. By the time that Tuesday night arrived, I was already tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. I loved my family, but the love felt conditional, tethered to my ability to keep things from falling apart. When my parents' number flashed on my phone, I answered out of habit. Their voices carried that familiar urgency, layered with reassurance. They explained the situation, careful not to frame it as a demand. They didn't have to. When they said I was stronger, more stable, better positioned to help, I heard the truth beneath it. My needs were flexible. His were not. After the call ended, I sat in the quiet and let myself feel what I'd been avoiding for years. It wasn't just anger or hurt. It was recognition. A slow, sinking understanding that the role I'd been praised for had limits, and I was reaching them. I thought about my child sleeping down the hall, about the future I wanted her to inherit. I thought about the example I was setting every time I said yes when I meant no. The realization didn't come with drama or raised voices. It came with a stillness that felt almost sacred. That's where my story truly begins. Not with conflict, but with awareness. With the moment I stopped explaining my exhaustion away and started listening to it instead. The knock on the door would soon pull me back into the world, into conversations and consequences I couldn't avoid. But before that, there was this internal shift, this quiet line I crossed without ceremony. To understand what happened next, you need to know how long I've been standing on that line, convincing myself it wasn't there at all. The knock at the door didn't belong to anyone I expected. It was a neighbor dropping off a package that had been misdelivered, smiling politely, unaware that my internal world had just tilted. After she left, the quiet returned, heavier this time. That interruption felt symbolic, like the universe reminding me that life keeps moving, even when your understanding of it shifts. I went back inside, locked the door, and leaned against it for a moment longer than necessary. My body felt tired, but my mind was unusually alert. Something had been named, and once named, it could no longer be ignored. In the days that followed, I replayed that phone call in pieces, not obsessively, but deliberately, like examining an old photograph under better light. I noticed details I had glossed over before, the way my parents framed their words as concern rather than expectation, the absence of any question about how I was doing, the assumption that my resources, emotional and financial, were available by default. None of it was new, and that was the most unsettling part. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. It was a pattern I had been living inside for decades, mistaking familiarity for fairness. I started paying attention to my own reactions, something I had rarely done without judgment. When my phone buzzed with a message from my mother, my chest tightened before I even read it. When my father's name appeared, I felt a sense of duty rise up, automatic and rehearsed. I realized how quickly I moved from contact to compliance, how little space there was between hearing a need and making it mine to solve. That reflex had once kept our family afloat, or so I believed. Now it felt like an old injury that never healed properly, only learned how to function. Growing up, emotions were handled efficiently in our house, which meant they were managed, not explored. There was no language for resentment or burnout, only gratitude and perseverance. If I was overwhelmed, it meant I needed to try harder. If I was upset, it meant I was being sensitive. I internalized those lessons so thoroughly that questioning them felt like a personal failing. Even now, as an adult with a life of my own, I felt guilty for reconsidering the rules I had been taught to live by. I began to see how deeply those rules had shaped my sense of worth. I measured my value by how much I could handle without complaint. I felt proud when others relied on me, even as it drained me. Independence wasn't just a trait, it was armor. Letting it crack felt dangerous. What if without it, I wasn't needed at all? That fear lingered quietly, influencing decisions I thought I was making freely. Conversations with my partner became mirrors I couldn't look away from. He noticed my distraction, my tendency to drift mid-sentence when my parents were mentioned. One evening, after I canceled plans because of a vague family obligation, he asked me a simple question. What would happen if you didn't fix this? I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I didn't know. That uncertainty had always scared me more than exhaustion. Fixing things gave me control. Stepping back meant trusting outcomes I couldn't predict. I thought about my brother often during that time, not with anger, but with a complicated mix of empathy and distance. We had grown up in the same house, but our experiences of it were entirely different. He had been allowed to struggle, to fail, to be uncertain. I had been encouraged to be steady, to adapt, to compensate. Neither role was chosen consciously, but both had consequences. I wondered what it would mean for him if I stopped stepping in. Would it force him to change, or would it simply shift the burden elsewhere? The answer, I realized, wasn't mine to manage. Memory has a way of reorganizing itself when you're ready to see it differently. Moments from my past resurfaced with new context. The time I skipped a school trip because money was tight, even though no one asked me to. The nights I stayed awake, worrying about adult problems I barely understood. The pride I felt when teachers praised my maturity, unaware of its source. None of these memories were dramatic on their own, but together they formed a narrative I could no longer dismiss. I had been trained, gently but consistently, to prioritize stability over self-expression. As I reflected, I noticed how often I had minimized my own needs before they even reached the surface. Desire felt indulgent. Rest felt earned only after usefulness. When I struggled, I framed it as temporary, something to push through quietly. This internal hierarchy had served me in practical ways, but it had also narrowed my emotional world. There were parts of myself I had never fully explored because they didn't align with the role I was expected to play. I didn't confront my parents right away. That wasn't avoidance, it was preparation. I needed to understand my own boundaries before I could articulate them. I needed to separate guilt from responsibility, love from obligation. This work happened mostly in silence, in small moments of honesty with myself, while folding laundry, while driving alone, while watching my child play without worrying about what came next. Those moments grounded me in a version of myself that wasn't defined by crisis response. There were days when doubt crept back in, persuasive and familiar. I questioned whether I was being unfair, whether I was rewriting history to justify my discomfort. On those days, I reminded myself that patterns don't become less real because they're subtle. Harm doesn't require cruelty to exist. Neglect can wear the mask of trust. These realizations didn't harden me. They softened something inside, allowing me to hold my experience without immediately excusing it. My parents continued to reach out, though cautiously now. Their messages were lighter, almost tentative, as if sensing a shift they couldn't name. I responded politely, briefly. Each exchange felt like a test, an opportunity to revert to old habits or try something new. I chose my words carefully, not to provoke, but to protect. That distinction mattered to me. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was trying to understand who I was when I wasn't managing someone else's life. This period of reflection didn't bring immediate clarity or relief. It was uncomfortable, stretching muscles I hadn't used before. I grieved the simplicity of my old identity, even as I recognized its cost. Letting go of a role can feel like losing a part of yourself, especially when it's been reinforced by praise and necessity. But beneath that grief was a quiet sense of alignment, a feeling that I was finally listening to something true. As weeks turned into months, the tension between who I had been and who I was becoming grew more pronounced. Situations arose that demanded a response, and each time, I paused. That pause was new. It gave me space to choose rather than react. Sometimes I still chose to help, but it was different. It came from willingness, not compulsion. Other times I declined, and the world didn't end. The realization that I could survive that discomfort was liberating in a way I hadn't anticipated. I began to understand that the strength I had been praised for wasn't inherent. It was cultivated, often at my own expense. True strength, I was learning, involved discernment. It meant knowing when to step in and when to step back. It meant trusting that relationships could withstand boundaries, and if they couldn't, that truth mattered. This understanding didn't resolve the underlying conflict with my family, but it reframed it. The issue was no longer about a single request or a single phone call. It was about a lifetime of learned responses and the courage it took to unlearn them. Looking back, I see this phase as a quiet threshold. Nothing exploded. No dramatic confrontations unfolded, but internally, everything was rearranging itself. I was moving from awareness to intention, from endurance to choice. The foundation was shifting, even if the structure still looked the same from the outside. That shift would soon be tested in ways I couldn't yet predict, pulling me into a confrontation not just with my family, but with the version of myself I had outgrown. The situation that finally tested me didn't arrive as a crisis. It came disguised as an invitation. My parents asked if we could all sit down together, just to talk. The phrasing was gentle, almost careful, as if they were handling something fragile. I agreed, telling myself that conversation didn't equal surrender. Still, as the date approached, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. The old reflexes stirred, ready to step back into place. I noticed them now, like muscle memory waking up after a long sleep. We met at their house, the same one where I'd grown up learning how to be quiet and capable. Walking through the front door felt like stepping into a version of myself I'd been trying to understand from a distance. The furniture hadn't changed much. The smells were the same. Even the way my parents greeted me carried that unspoken relief, as if my presence stabilized the room. I reminded myself to breathe, to stay present, to listen without immediately absorbing. At first, the conversation stayed on safe ground. Updates about work, about my child, about small, neutral things. Then, slowly, it shifted. My mother spoke about how hard things had been lately. My father nodded, adding details that painted a picture of strain without ever naming responsibility. I could feel the direction we were heading in, like recognizing a familiar road sign. My body prepared to merge without being asked. When the request finally came, it wasn't framed as one. It was presented as concern, as shared problem-solving. They talked about uncertainty, about needing support, about how family shows up for each other. I waited, letting the words settle instead of rushing to respond. That pause felt loud. My mother filled it quickly, her voice soft but insistent. She reminded me of how capable I was, how much they trusted me, how much this would mean. Something inside me stayed still. For the first time, the old sense of urgency didn't take over. I noticed the familiar guilt trying to surface, but it didn't carry the same authority. I realized I wasn't confused about what they were asking. I was clear. And clarity, I was learning, didn't always come with comfort. I told them I couldn't do what they were implying. I said it calmly, without explanation or apology. The words felt strange in my mouth, but also solid. My father looked surprised. My mother's expression shifted, moving quickly through disbelief into something sharper. She asked if I understood the consequences, if I knew what would happen if I didn't help. Her tone suggested that my refusal was reckless, almost cruel. That's when the conversation reached its breaking point. Not because voices were raised, but because something unspoken was finally visible. My mother said she never expected this from me. That sentence landed heavily, carrying years of expectation inside it. I realized she wasn't reacting to my decision. She was reacting to the loss of a role she had depended on. And in that moment, I understood how much of my identity in this family was tied to being reliable above all else. I tried to explain, briefly, that I wasn't abandoning anyone, that I was making a choice about my limits. The words sounded reasonable to me, but they didn't seem to land. My parents weren't hearing boundaries. They were hearing rejection. The gap between those interpretations felt impossible to bridge. My father grew quiet, retreating into himself the way he always had when things became emotionally complex. My mother pressed on, her voice trembling now, asking how I could live with myself knowing I had the ability to help and chose not to. In the middle of that tension, something unexpected happened. I felt a deep, steady calm settle in. It wasn't indifference. It was resolve. For years, I had confused emotional intensity with truth, believing that the strongest feelings carried the most validity. Now I saw that clarity could be quiet, that choosing myself didn't require justification beyond honesty. If you're still listening right now, maybe part of you recognizes this moment, the point where explaining stops working and understanding has to come from within. I told them I loved them and that this decision wasn't up for debate. I didn't list reasons, I didn't argue facts, I simply stated what I could and couldn't do. The room felt heavy after that, like the air had thickened. My mother looked away, hurt and frustrated. My father nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something he didn't like but couldn't deny. The conversation wound down after that, not with resolution, but with a kind of stunned silence. Driving home, I replayed the interaction, not to criticize myself, but to understand it. I noticed how often I'd been tempted to soften my stance, to offer a compromise that would ease their discomfort. I noticed how deeply ingrained my need to be perceived as good still was. But I also noticed something else. I hadn't crossed my own boundary. The world hadn't collapsed. The discomfort, while real, was survivable. In the days that followed, the fallout arrived in waves. Messages from relatives, carefully worded but clearly aligned. Suggestions that I reconsider. Reminders of family values. None of them were overtly harsh, but each carried an undercurrent of judgment. I read them slowly, giving myself permission not to respond right away. I realized how often I'd been trained to treat others' feelings as emergencies, while treating my own as inconveniences. My parents' communication changed too. My mother oscillated between silence and brief, pointed remarks. My father sent a few neutral updates, as if trying to maintain normalcy. The absence of warmth was noticeable, and it hurt more than I expected. I grieved not just the relationship I was losing, but the one I'd hoped we might have. That grief didn't mean I was wrong. It meant I was human. The emotional peak of this period wasn't dramatic from the outside. There were no confrontations, no ultimatums. But internally, I was navigating a storm of conflicting loyalties. I loved my parents. I understood their fears. I also understood that continuing the pattern would slowly erode the life I was building. Holding those truths at the same time required a kind of emotional strength I was only beginning to develop. I found myself thinking often about my child during this time, about the example I was setting, not through words, but through choices. I wondered what she would learn about self-worth by watching me respond to pressure. Would she learn that love required self-erasure, or that care could exist alongside boundaries? That question guided me when doubt crept in. There were moments when I almost reached out, ready to smooth things over, to restore the old balance. In those moments, I paused and asked myself what I was really trying to fix. Was it the relationship, or my own discomfort with being seen differently? That distinction mattered. I was learning that not all tension needed immediate resolution. Some of it needed space. As the weeks passed, the intensity of the situation didn't fade, but it changed. The initial shock gave way to a quieter, more persistent pressure. This was the true climax, not a single argument, but the sustained challenge of holding my ground without external validation. I was no longer reacting to one request. I was responding to a lifetime of expectation. I began to see how deeply my family's narrative relied on my compliance. Without it, their story about how things worked didn't quite make sense. That realization was both painful and freeing. Painful because it meant accepting that my role had been more functional than relational. Freeing because it allowed me to step out of a script that no longer fit. This phase forced me to confront a difficult truth. Boundaries don't guarantee understanding. They reveal it. The way my parents responded wasn't a measure of my love or my effort. It was a reflection of their capacity to see me as separate from the role I'd played. Accepting that took more courage than saying no ever had. By the end of this period, I was exhausted in a new way. Not drained, but stretched. I felt myself standing at the edge of something irreversible. I had challenged a system that had defined me for most of my life, and there was no going back to who I'd been before. The question now wasn't whether the conflict would resolve neatly. It was whether I was willing to keep choosing myself, even when the cost was emotional distance. That question lingered, unanswered but unavoidable, carrying me forward into the next phase of my story. After that meeting, time didn't soften anything the way I secretly hoped it might. Instead, it clarified what had already been set in motion. The tension didn't explode, it settled. It lived in the pauses between messages, in the careful phrasing of emails, in the way my name appeared less often in group conversations. I had expected anger or confrontation. What I hadn't expected was this slow withdrawal, this quiet reorganization of the family around the absence of my automatic yes. At first, I questioned myself constantly, not in the dramatic, self-blaming way I used to, but in a quieter, more persistent way. I replayed conversations in my head while doing ordinary things, like washing dishes or driving to work. I wondered if there had been a softer way to say no, a more reassuring tone I could have used. I wondered if I'd underestimated how much they relied on me, not just practically, but emotionally. Those thoughts didn't come from regret so much as habit. My mind was used to scanning for ways to restore balance, even when that balance came at my expense. What surprised me most was how alone I felt inside the conflict. Friends listened sympathetically, but their lives didn't revolve around this tension. My partner was supportive, but he couldn't fully inhabit the emotional history that made this so heavy. My parents were locked into their own perspective, unable or unwilling to see beyond it. I realized then that growth often happens in isolation. Not because others don't care, but because certain shifts are deeply personal. No one else could resolve this for me. No one else could validate it enough to make it painless. As the weeks went on, small incidents took on outsized meaning. A family update shared without including me. A decision made without asking my input for the first time. These moments stung, even though they were evidence of the very independence I was trying to claim. Part of me missed being consulted, being essential. That part didn't disappear just because I recognized it as a pattern. Letting go of importance felt eerily similar to being abandoned, and I had to sit with that discomfort instead of rushing to fix it. The true peak of this phase wasn't a single confrontation. It was the accumulation of moments where I had to choose how to interpret what was happening. Was I being punished, or was the system adjusting to my absence? Was their distance proof that I had overestimated my place, or proof that my place had been conditional all along? Those questions didn't have neat answers. They pressed against each other, demanding a more nuanced understanding than I was used to allowing myself. One evening, after putting my child to bed, I sat alone in the living room and felt the weight of it all settle in my chest. Not panic, not despair, just a deep, aching sadness. I mourned the version of my family I had believed in, the one where love was mutual and support flowed both ways. I realized how much of that belief had been sustained by my effort. Without it, the picture looked different. That realization hurt more than the conflict itself. I thought about my parents as individuals, separate from the roles they played in my life. I saw their fear of instability, their exhaustion, their own learned patterns. Understanding them didn't erase the impact of their expectations, but it complicated my anger. I wasn't dealing with villains. I was dealing with people who had come to rely on a dynamic that worked for them. Changing it meant unsettling something they didn't know how to rebuild. That understanding didn't make me want to give in. It made me want to be precise. to stop framing this as a moral battle and start seeing it as a structural one. I wasn't withdrawing love. I was withdrawing a function. The problem was that for them, those two things had become inseparable. Recognizing that distinction gave me language, at least internally, for what I was doing. It wasn't cruelty. It was redefinition. During this time, my brother remained mostly absent from my direct experience. I heard about him through fragments, filtered through my parents' tone, updates without details, progress implied, then quietly walked back. I noticed how little space there was for my feelings in those narratives. My role had always been to stabilize, not to question outcomes. Now that I wasn't stepping in, the story felt unfinished, and that unsettled everyone involved. I wrestled with a familiar urge to intervene, not because I believed it was right, but because it would end the discomfort. There were nights when I drafted messages in my head, offering limited help, controlled support, carefully negotiated compromises. Each time, I asked myself the same question. Would this come from choice or from fear of being excluded? More often than not, the answer was fear. So I stayed quiet. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with learning. I noticed how my body responded when I didn't rush to soothe others. The anxiety would spike, then slowly recede. I noticed how my thoughts changed when I stopped rehearsing explanations. I began to trust that not every emotional reaction required immediate action. This was new territory for me, uncomfortable, but expansive. My relationship with my partner deepened during this period in subtle ways. We talked more honestly about emotional labor, about the invisible responsibilities I had carried for years without naming them. He listened without trying to solve, which was exactly what I needed. Through those conversations, I started to articulate needs I hadn't previously known how to express. Not just the need for rest or support, but the need to exist without constant evaluation. There were moments when guilt returned sharply, triggered by small reminders of the past. A childhood memory resurfacing unexpectedly, a familiar phrase echoing in my head. In those moments, I practiced something radical for me. I let the feeling exist without immediately obeying it. I reminded myself that guilt wasn't proof of wrongdoing. It was often proof of conditioning. That distinction changed everything. The emotional intensity of this phase reached its height when my mother finally confronted the distance directly. Her message was long, carefully written, heavy with disappointment and confusion. She asked how things had gotten so far off track. She expressed hurt at my withdrawal, framing it as sudden and inexplicable. Reading her words, I felt the old urge to explain myself thoroughly, to lay out every reason, every feeling, every justification. I wanted to be understood. But as I sat with the message, something clicked. I realized that I had already explained myself, multiple times, in different ways. The lack of understanding wasn't due to a lack of information. It was due to a resistance to accepting a version of me that didn't align with their expectations. That realization marked the emotional peak of this chapter. Not because it resolved the conflict, but because it resolved my confusion about it. I replied briefly. I acknowledged her feelings without taking responsibility for them. I restated my boundary without embellishment. I expressed hope for a relationship that respected mutual limits. Then I stopped. Sending that message felt like stepping off a ledge, not knowing where I'd land. The wait for her response was tense, filled with all the old doubts. But underneath those doubts was something steadier than I'd ever felt before. Her reply came days later. It was restrained, polite, distant. There was no breakthrough, no reconciliation, but there was also no escalation. the conflict settled into a new, uneasy shape. That was the moment I understood that this wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a reality to be lived with. And living with it would require ongoing commitment to the choices I'd made. The climax of this phase wasn't about winning or losing. It was about enduring the uncertainty that followed change. I had disrupted a long-standing pattern, and the aftermath was ambiguous. Relationships didn't snap back into place. They recalibrated, slowly, unevenly, sometimes painfully. Accepting that process without trying to control it was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. By the end of this period, I felt different, though it was hard to articulate how. Not lighter, exactly, more grounded. I had confronted the deepest fear beneath my compliance, the fear of losing connection if I stopped being useful. That fear hadn't disappeared, but it no longer dictated my behavior. I was beginning to see myself not as a support structure, but as a person with agency. This chapter of my story closed not with resolution, but with a shift in orientation. I stopped measuring my actions by how they were received and started measuring them by how they aligned with my values. The conflict with my family remained unresolved, but my internal conflict had changed shape. I was no longer standing at the edge of a decision. I had crossed it. What came next wouldn't be about confrontation. It would be about integration, about learning how to live as myself, not just in opposition to old roles, but beyond them. That transition would demand a different kind of courage, quieter, but more sustained, as I moved from reacting to redefining the life I was building. The shift didn't announce itself with relief or confidence. It arrived as a kind of emptiness, subtle and unsettling. Once the conflict settled into its new shape, there was no longer anything to push against. No urgent messages, no emotional fires to put out. For the first time in my life, I wasn't actively managing a family crisis. I expected to feel free. Instead, I felt disoriented, like a muscle that had finally relaxed after years of tension and didn't know what to do next. Without the constant pull of obligation, I started to notice how much of my identity had been organized around anticipation. Anticipating needs, anticipating disappointment, anticipating the next moment when I would be required to step in. That anticipation had structured my days, my choices, even my sense of time. Now, with nothing demanding immediate response, I felt strangely untethered. It wasn't peace yet. It was space. And space, I learned, can be uncomfortable when you're not used to having it. I began to recognize how often I had confused intensity with purpose. My life had always felt meaningful because it was busy with responsibility. Removing that responsibility left questions I hadn't asked before. What did I want when no one else was waiting for my answer? How did I measure a good day when it wasn't defined by how much I'd handled? These questions weren't dramatic, but they were persistent. They followed me through routine moments, like background noise that slowly demanded attention. At first, I filled the space the only way I knew how. I took on more at work. I volunteered for extra tasks. I over-prepared for things that didn't require it. I told myself I was being productive, but underneath that was the familiar urge to justify my existence through usefulness. The difference now was that I could see it. Awareness didn't stop the behavior immediately, but it softened my attachment to it. I started catching myself mid-pattern, asking whether I was choosing something or defaulting to it. The real turning point came in an ordinary moment. I was sitting on the floor of my child's room, watching her play. She was focused, content, absorbed in her own small world. She didn't need anything from me right then. She didn't need direction or correction or reassurance. She just needed presence.
As I watched her, it struck me how unfamiliar that role still felt. Being there without doing, loving without fixing, allowing instead of managing. That moment didn't feel profound at first. It felt quiet. But it stayed with me. I realized how often I had been praised for being selfless without anyone questioning what that selflessness cost. How easily I had accepted that cost as the price of love. Watching my child, I knew I didn't want her to grow up believing that love required constant self-sacrifice. I wanted her to know that her needs mattered, even when they were inconvenient. That clarity didn't come from anger toward my parents. It came from a forward-looking sense of responsibility. I wasn't just breaking a pattern, I was choosing what to pass on.
That choice began to show up in small, practical ways. I started saying no without explanation in low-stakes situations, declining invitations when I was tired, asking for help instead of assuming it wasn't available. These weren't dramatic acts of rebellion, they were quiet experiments. Each one challenged the belief that asserting my needs would lead to rejection. And each time, the world responded more gently than I expected. Some people adjusted. Some didn't notice. A few resisted. None of it destroyed the relationships that mattered most. Still, there were moments when the old guilt resurfaced, sharp and persuasive. Especially when my parents' situation came up indirectly. A comment from a relative, a vague update passed along secondhand. Those moments triggered the familiar narrative. You could help. You're choosing not to. I learned to sit with that discomfort instead of arguing with it. I reminded myself that capacity didn't equal obligation, that having the ability to do something didn't mean it was healthy to do it. The internal work during this phase was less about conflict and more about reconstruction. I had dismantled an identity built around responsibility. Now I had to build something in its place. That process was slow and often invisible. It happened in the way I spoke to myself, in the standards I held for rest, in the permission I gave myself to enjoy things without earning them first. These changes didn't feel heroic. They felt necessary. I also began to see my parents differently. Not just as figures in conflict, but as people navigating the consequences of a system that no longer functioned as it once had. Their discomfort didn't mean I was wrong. It meant the structure had shifted. Systems resist change, even when that change is healthier. Accepting that helped me stop personalizing their reactions. I wasn't responsible for their adjustment. I was responsible for my integrity. One afternoon, my mother called unexpectedly. Her voice was cautious, almost formal. The conversation stayed surface level, focused on logistics and neutral updates. There was an unspoken tension beneath every word, a sense that we were both testing the boundaries of this new dynamic. When the call ended, I noticed something surprising. I didn't feel drained. I felt steady. The interaction hadn't required me to perform or placate. It had simply existed. That was new. Not every interaction went that way. Some left me unsettled, questioning whether this new version of myself was sustainable. On those days, I reminded myself that discomfort wasn't failure. It was part of recalibration. I was learning to tolerate being misunderstood, a skill I'd never needed before because I'd worked so hard to be clear, agreeable, and reliable. Letting go of that reflex was like learning a new language. Awkward at first, inconsistent, but gradually more fluent. The most challenging part of this phase was grieving what would never be repaired. Not every relationship evolves into something healthier. Some simply change form, losing intimacy even as they retain connection. Accepting that loss required honesty I hadn't practiced before. I allowed myself to feel sad without rushing to fix it. I allowed disappointment to exist without immediately reframing it. This grief wasn't loud, but it was real, and honoring it made the rest of the work possible. There was a moment, months into this process, when I realized I hadn't thought about fixing my family in days. The realization startled me. For so long, that concern had occupied so much mental space. Its absence felt like silence after constant noise. In that silence, other thoughts began to emerge. Curiosity, creativity, even joy, tentative at first, then more assured. I started imagining a future that wasn't shaped in reaction to my past, a future built intentionally. This was the heart of the turning point, not the act of saying no, but the act of choosing what yes would mean going forward. Yes to rest. Yes to mutual relationships. Yes to a life that didn't require justification. These choices didn't erase my history, but they changed how much power it held. I wasn't rejecting where I came from. I was refusing to let it dictate where I was going. Near the end of this phase, I caught myself wanting to share this realization with someone who might recognize it. Not to persuade or convince, but to offer companionship in the uncertainty. If any part of this turning point feels familiar to you, if you're standing in that uncomfortable space between who you were and who you're becoming, you don't have to move through it alone. Sometimes just staying present with the process is enough. The final test of this phase came quietly. A small request from my parents, framed carefully, deliberately modest. It would have been easy to agree. Low risk, minimal effort. I paused, checked in with myself, and declined. Not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't aligned. The response was muted, slightly disappointed, but contained. No fallout, no escalation. That moment confirmed what I had been learning all along. Boundaries don't have to be dramatic to be effective. Consistency is what reshapes relationships. By the time I reached the end of this period, something fundamental had shifted. I no longer felt like I was defending my right to exist separately. I was simply living that separation. The need to justify myself had loosened its grip. I still cared. I still loved. But I was no longer organizing my life around preventing other people's discomfort. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the point where the direction became clear. I had moved from resistance to intention, from reaction to authorship. What lay ahead wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about affirming, day by day, the kind of life I was willing to sustain. By the time I noticed how natural the new rhythm felt, I realized it had already taken root. The absence of constant tension no longer felt like something temporary or fragile. It felt lived in, ordinary. The days were still full, but they were no longer crowded with emotional calculations. I wasn't bracing for the next request or preparing explanations in advance. That shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as normalcy, and that made it more powerful than any dramatic breakthrough could have been. I began to recognize how much energy I had once spent monitoring other people's reactions. Every interaction used to carry a hidden layer of assessment. Was I being helpful enough? Was I coming across as cooperative? Was there disappointment I needed to soften before it grew? Without realizing it, I had been managing perceptions as much as situations. Letting go of that habit freed up a surprising amount of mental space. I didn't immediately know what to do with it, but I could feel the relief in my body. My shoulders rested differently. My breath slowed without effort. The most striking change was how my internal dialogue softened. For years, my thoughts had carried a tone of urgency, even in calm moments. There was always something to stay ahead of, some invisible deadline tied to other people's needs. Now, that urgency faded. In its place came a quieter, more curious voice. It asked different questions. What feels sustainable? What actually matters today? What would it look like to respond instead of react? Those questions didn't demand immediate answers. They invited reflection. I noticed this shift most clearly in moments that would have once triggered automatic compliance. A last-minute change of plans, a request framed as a favor, but carrying expectation beneath it. In the past, I would have felt my body lean forward instinctively, ready to adjust, to accommodate. Now there was a pause, not hesitation, awareness. In that pause, I checked in with myself, not to justify a decision, but to understand it. Sometimes the answer was yes, other times it was no. What mattered was that the answer came from alignment rather than fear. My relationship with time also changed. I stopped packing my schedule defensively, as if leaving space would invite intrusion. I allowed afternoons to unfold without structure. I let evenings end early when I was tired. These choices seemed small, almost trivial, but they accumulated. Each one reinforced the idea that my well-being didn't need to be earned through productivity or sacrifice. Rest wasn't a reward, it was a requirement. There were still moments when the old patterns surfaced unexpectedly. A comment from my parents that carried subtle implication. A family story retold in a way that emphasized past sacrifices. In those moments, I felt the familiar pull to reinsert myself into the narrative, to remind everyone of my role. But instead of acting on that impulse, I observed it. I acknowledged the part of me that wanted recognition, not because it was wrong, but because it had once been the only way I felt seen. That compassion toward myself changed how the urge passed. It lost its grip more quickly. I also became more aware of how often I had equated closeness with obligation. Growing up, intimacy in my family was built around shared problem-solving. We connected through stress, through navigating difficulties together. Without that constant stress, the shape of connection changed. Conversations became simpler, sometimes shallower. There was less intensity, less urgency. At first, that felt like loss. Over time, I realized it was also honesty. We were relating within the limits of what was actually available, not what had been forced into existence by crisis. This realization extended beyond my family. I began to reevaluate other relationships in my life, noticing where I felt energized and where I felt depleted. I noticed how often I had gravitated toward roles that mirrored my upbringing, taking on responsibility in subtle ways. Being the listener, the organizer, the one who remembered details others forgot. I didn't stop doing these things entirely, but I stopped assuming they were my job. I allowed others to step in, even when their efforts looked different from mine, even when things weren't done perfectly. That willingness to tolerate imperfection was new. It challenged the belief that my involvement was necessary to maintain quality or harmony. I watched as situations resolved themselves without my intervention. Not always smoothly, but adequately. The world didn't unravel when I loosened my grip. That observation reshaped my understanding of control. Much of what I had called responsibility had actually been fear dressed up as competence. As this phase continued, I noticed a subtle shift in how my parents interacted with me. The initial tension softened, though it didn't disappear. Our conversations became more cautious, more contained. There were moments of warmth, but they were brief, almost tentative. I could sense them adjusting, testing the boundaries just as I was. Sometimes they slipped into old patterns, and I gently redirected. Other times, they respected the limits without comment. Neither outcome felt triumphant. Both felt real. I stopped waiting for acknowledgement or apology. That expectation had kept me emotionally tethered to an outcome I couldn't control. Letting go of it wasn't easy. It meant accepting that my experience might never be fully validated by the people who shaped it. but it also meant reclaiming my energy. I could invest it where it was returned, where mutuality existed without negotiation. The concept of mutuality became central to how I understood relationships. I began to notice how different it felt to give when there was no underlying pressure. Generosity, when freely chosen, carried a lightness I wasn't used to. It didn't leave me resentful or depleted. It didn't require mental bookkeeping. This distinction helped me untangle love from obligation in a way I hadn't thought possible. I reflected often on how my childhood had prepared me to be resilient, but not necessarily reflective. Strength had been emphasized, endurance celebrated. There had been little space for vulnerability that didn't resolve into action. As an adult, I was learning that reflection was a form of strength too. That sitting with discomfort without immediately fixing it required courage. That emotional maturity involved knowing when to step back as much as knowing when to step in. There was a moment during this phase when my parents faced a challenge that would have once pulled me back into the center of things. I learned about it indirectly, through a brief mention that carried expectation beneath its neutrality. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to reach out and offer help. I paused. I considered what involvement would mean. I considered what stepping back would mean. Then I chose to remain at a distance. Not out of spite or indifference, but out of clarity. That decision felt significant, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. The aftermath of that choice was quiet. No confrontation, no fallout. Just a subtle acknowledgement that the old dynamic no longer operated by default. That realization brought an unexpected sense of peace. It confirmed that boundaries, once established and maintained, become part of the environment. They don't need constant defense. They simply exist. As I settled into this new way of being, I noticed how my sense of self expanded. Without the constant demand to be useful, other qualities emerged: curiosity, playfulness, creativity. I pursued interests without turning them into obligations. I allowed myself to be bad at things without self-criticism. These experiences felt almost foreign at first, like trying on a different posture. Over time, they became familiar. The process wasn't linear. There were setbacks, days when I slipped into old habits without realizing it. Moments when I felt the sting of exclusion more sharply than I expected. Instead of interpreting these moments as failure, I began to see them as reminders of how deeply ingrained the patterns had been. Change, I learned, didn't erase history. It rewrote the present. One of the most profound changes was how I related to my own emotions. I stopped treating them as signals that something needed immediate correction. I allowed sadness to exist without turning it into a problem. I allowed anger to inform me without directing my actions. This emotional literacy took time to develop. It required patience with myself, something I hadn't practiced much before. Through all of this, my relationship with my child continued to anchor me. Parenting from this new place felt different. I was more present, less distracted by internal noise. I listened more. I reacted less. I modeled boundaries not through lectures, but through example. Watching her navigate her own small frustrations, I felt a quiet pride. Not because I was doing everything right, but because I was doing things differently. This phase marked the end of transition and the beginning of embodiment. The changes I had been making internally were now reflected in how I lived day to day. I wasn't actively resisting my old role anymore. I had moved beyond it. The identity built around constant responsibility no longer defined me, though it still informed parts of who I was. I could honor the resilience it gave me without continuing to pay its full cost. I understood now that breaking a pattern didn't mean rejecting everything it had produced. It meant integrating what was useful and releasing what was harmful. That integration required ongoing awareness, not vigilance, but attentiveness. I didn't need to be on guard. I needed to stay honest. As this chapter drew to a close, I felt a sense of steadiness that didn't depend on external validation. The conflict with my family hadn't resolved neatly, but it no longer dominated my internal landscape. I had learned how to hold complexity without being consumed by it. I had learned that choosing myself didn't require severing connection, but it did require redefining it. What lay ahead was not a continuation of struggle, but a period of affirmation, not in the sense of proving anything to others, but in the sense of living in alignment with the values I had clarified. The work of transition was largely complete. What remained was the work of maintenance, of returning to these choices again and again, even when no one was watching. This was the end of the turning point, not because everything was settled, but because the direction was no longer in question. I had stepped fully into a life that no longer revolved around being the backup plan. And from here, the story would move not toward conflict, but toward confirmation of what that life could become. What surprised me most about this final phase wasn't how dramatic it felt, but how ordinary. I had expected affirmation to arrive as confidence, maybe even pride. Instead, it showed up as consistency, as days that felt aligned without requiring constant effort, as decisions that no longer needed internal debate. I wasn't asking myself who I needed to be in each moment. I was simply being. The life I was living now didn't look radically different from the outside. I still worked, I still parented, I still showed up to family gatherings when I chose to, but internally, the orientation had shifted. I was no longer scanning for approval or bracing for disappointment. I wasn't preparing explanations in advance or rehearsing emotional defenses. The absence of that constant vigilance felt like a quiet kind of wealth. I began to trust my internal signals in a way I never had before. Fatigue meant rest, not weakness. Discomfort meant information, not failure. Desire meant possibility, not selfishness. These weren't new concepts, but they were newly embodied. I wasn't just understanding them intellectually, I was living them, often without noticing until I looked back and saw how far I'd come. My relationship with my parents settled into something stable, though not particularly close. We spoke regularly, but not deeply. There was a politeness to our interactions now, a careful respect that had replaced the old familiarity. Sometimes I missed the intensity of our previous dynamic, even knowing how unhealthy it had been. Familiar patterns have a way of masquerading as intimacy. Letting go of them requires grieving not just what was, but what you hoped they could be. I no longer waited for my parents to acknowledge my choices or validate my experience. That waiting had kept me emotionally suspended for years. Releasing it felt like setting down a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. Their understanding, I learned, was not a prerequisite for my peace. I could hold compassion for their limitations without shrinking myself to accommodate them. There were moments when old narratives resurfaced, especially during family milestones or shared memories. A story retold in a way that emphasized sacrifice. A comment that hinted at expectation. In those moments, I didn't correct or defend. I noticed the pull, acknowledged it internally, and let it pass. I didn't need to reinsert myself into the narrative to know my truth. That confidence didn't feel loud, it felt settled. Affirmation also showed up in how I treated myself when things went wrong. I still made mistakes. I still overcommitted at times. The difference was how I responded afterward. Instead of self-criticism, I offered myself curiosity. What led me here? What do I need now? That shift changed everything. It turned setbacks into feedback rather than evidence of failure. I noticed how much more present I was in my own life, Conversations felt fuller because I wasn't managing them. I listened without strategizing. I spoke without filtering every thought through potential impact. This presence deepened my relationships, not just with my partner and child, but with friends and colleagues. People responded to the authenticity, even when it meant I was less accommodating than before. My partner once commented that I seemed more relaxed, but also more grounded. I understood what he meant. I wasn't bending as much, but I wasn't brittle either. The flexibility I had now came from choice, not compulsion. That distinction changed how love flowed between us. Our relationship felt more mutual, less asymmetrical. I could receive care without discomfort. I could ask for support without apology. Parenting from this place continued to reinforce everything I was learning. I paid attention to the messages my actions sent, not just my words. I modeled rest. I modeled saying no kindly. I modeled apologizing without self-erasure. Watching my child absorb these behaviors reminded me why this work mattered. Healing isn't just personal. It's generational. I thought often about the version of myself who had answered every call without question, who believed strength meant endurance. I didn't judge her. I honored her. She had done the best she could with what she knew. She had kept things together when no one else would. She had carried more than her share because she didn't know another way. Recognizing that allowed me to integrate my past without being trapped by it. Affirmation also meant acknowledging that some losses were permanent. Certain closeness would never return. Certain conversations would never happen. Accepting that didn't mean I approved of it. It meant I stopped fighting reality. That acceptance freed energy I could invest elsewhere, in relationships that offered reciprocity and respect without negotiation. I became more intentional about where I placed my time and attention. I no longer spread myself thin to maintain appearances or fulfill unspoken expectations. I chose depth over breadth, quality over obligation. These choices weren't always comfortable, but they were consistent. Over time, consistency built trust, both internally and externally. The concept of being the backup plan lost its grip on me, not because my family never needed help again, but because I was no longer automatically available. Availability became something I chose, not something assumed. That change altered how others approached me, but more importantly, it altered how I approached myself. I was no longer defining my worth by my utility. There were moments when I noticed how differently I moved through the world. I walked slower. I paused more often. I allowed myself to be uncertain without rushing to resolve it. These changes weren't conscious decisions. They were the natural result of no longer living in a state of anticipatory stress. My nervous system, long accustomed to vigilance, was learning a new baseline. I reflected on how this journey had unfolded not through dramatic acts, but through sustained honesty. Saying no once mattered. Saying no consistently mattered more. Listening to myself mattered most. Change didn't come from confrontation. It came from alignment, from returning again and again to what felt true. The affirmation phase wasn't about proving that I had been right all along. It was about living in a way that no longer required proof. I didn't need to justify my boundaries. I didn't need to explain my choices. I knew why I made them. That knowing was enough. As I moved forward, I carried with me a clear understanding of what I was willing to give and what I needed to protect. I understood that love without boundaries isn't sustainable, that generosity without choice breeds resentment, that strength without self-awareness becomes self-neglect. These weren't lessons I had learned once and moved on from. They were principles I returned to regularly. My family remained part of my life, but not the center of it. They occupied a defined space, one that no longer expanded to fill every available corner. That balance felt healthy, even when it felt sad. I allowed both feelings to coexist. Maturity, I learned, often looks like holding opposing truths without needing to collapse them into one. There was a quiet pride in knowing I had changed the trajectory of my life without burning it down. I hadn't walked away in anger. I hadn't demanded transformation from others. I had simply chosen myself, repeatedly, until that choice became normal. That kind of change doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself over time. Looking back, I see that the hardest part wasn't setting boundaries. It was believing I was allowed to have them. Once that belief shifted, the rest followed. Imperfectly, but steadily. Affirmation wasn't something I received from the outside. It was something I cultivated internally, through lived experience. I don't tell this story because it has a perfect ending. It doesn't. Relationships remain complex. Feelings remain layered. But the foundation I stand on now is solid. I know who I am separate from what I provide. I know what I value. I know what I'm willing to sustain. If there is one truth that defines this final chapter, it's this. I was never the problem that needed to be solved. I was a person who learned early how to adapt. Choosing to stop adapting didn't make me selfish. It made me whole. This life, the one I'm living now, isn't built on being needed. It's built on being present. And that has made all the difference. These days, my life feels quieter in a way I once thought was impossible. Not empty, not lonely, just steady. I wake up without that familiar knot in my chest, the one that used to come from waiting for the next problem to solve. My days are shaped by choices that feel intentional rather than reactive. I spend time with my child without my mind drifting elsewhere. I rest without needing a reason. When my phone rings, I no longer feel obligated to answer immediately, and that alone has changed how my body understands safety. The drama that once defined my inner world has settled. Not because everything is perfect, but because I'm no longer at war with myself. Looking back, I see that the most important shift wasn't external. It was internal. I learned that strength doesn't mean enduring everything in silence. It means knowing what you can carry without losing yourself. I learned that love, when it's real, doesn't require you to disappear. It can coexist with limits, with distance, with honesty. For a long time, I believed my value came from how much I could give without complaint. Now I understand that giving only has meaning when it's chosen, not expected. Responsibility without consent slowly turns into resentment, even in families built on good intentions. What this experience taught me is something I didn't want to believe at first. You can care deeply about people and still decide not to save them. You can honor where you came from without letting it dictate where you're going. And you can stop playing a role without becoming a villain. These truths didn't arrive all at once. They revealed themselves gradually, through practice, through discomfort, through the courage to stay present when old patterns tried to pull me back in. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, I want you to know you're not broken for feeling tired. You're not ungrateful for wanting space. And you're not selfish for choosing a life that doesn't revolve around fixing everyone else. If you grew up being the strong one, the reliable one, the backup plan, it makes sense that setting boundaries feels terrifying. That fear doesn't mean you're wrong. It means you're changing something that once kept you safe. You're allowed to move slowly. You're allowed to feel conflicted. You're allowed to choose yourself without having all the answers. I didn't arrive at peace by cutting people out or winning arguments. I arrived here by listening to myself consistently, even when it was uncomfortable. Healing, I've learned, isn't loud. It's steady. It shows up in how you treat yourself on ordinary days. It shows up in the moments you pause instead of reacting. And it grows stronger every time you choose alignment over approval. If you want to continue this journey with me, there's another story waiting. One that explores what happens when you stop being the family anchor and start becoming the author of your own life.